Bom, boa tarde a todos. É um imenso prazer aqui, nosso do Instituto de Economia, da pós-graduação do Instituto de Economia, termos aqui a presença de dois ilustres visitantes, o professor Guy Standing, o senador Suplicy. Teremos uma tarde muito interessante aqui de debates. O professor Guy Standing é um professor de Development Studies, né, School of Oriental and African Studies da Universidade de Londres, foi diretor de pesquisas da OIT e tem um livro importantíssimo, interessantíssimo, que já foi editado em português, que se chama O Precariado, uma nova classe perigosa, e está recém lançando um novo livro, e fazendo inclusive um circuito pelo mundo, estava contando para nós, para o lançamento deste novo livro, que é uma continuação deste livro do Precariado. Bom, o senador Suplicy dispensa apresentações, ambos estão juntos, inclusive, numa rede internacional importante que se chama Basic Income Earth Network. Né? O senador Suplicy é co-presidente honorário, o Guy Standing é co-presidente, foram ambos fundadores dessa importante associação. Então, vamos iniciar imediatamente o debate. Eu vou passar a palavra para o professor Carlos Salas, que fará a moderação do debate. E agradeço a presença de todos aqui. E agradeço muitíssimo a presença dos nossos dois convidados. It's really a pleasure to have you here, Professor.
Boa tarde. Eu vou falar parte em português, parte em inglês, por motivo do professor. Realmente é um enorme prazer ter aqui as duas pessoas para falar sobre um tema interessantíssimo, e particularmente por causa da experiência que eles têm, uma experiência que provavelmente vai aparecer aqui na fala, e posteriormente no debate. Falar o anterior, inicialmente o professor Guy Standing vai começar com uma breve apresentação do seu texto, que eu acho que vai ser um sucesso da imprensa. E posteriormente o senador Suplicy nos acompanhará. Bom, it's your turn.
Well, first of all, I apologize for not being able to speak Portuguese, and I hope my English is as clear as possible so that you can follow it. If I speak too fast, or if I say too many words that cannot be understood, please wave your hands and I'll try and simplify. I should know more Portuguese than I do because I've been to Brazil many times, and mainly because of my friendship with Eduardo Suplicy and an interest in many of the phenomena that are affecting Brazil as in much of the rest of the world. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is try and briefly summarize a journey that I have been on. I worked in the International Labour Organization for many years, and I was thrown out 3 times. And I'm one of the only people I know who can genuinely say that it's a good thing to be dismissed. Because each time I was invited back at a higher level than when they threw me out. Now, the reason I had the problems was that I was fundamentally dissatisfied with the model of what I call laborism that the ILO had promoted in the 20th century. So after my last falling out with the ILO, and I left, I wrote this book, which is called Work After Globalization. In a sense, this book took me 30 years to write, because I had to come to terms with what it was that I disliked about the 20th century model of social democracy and laborism. And it fundamentally starts with the realization that the 20th century made a historical error in defining what was work. Because in the 20th century, unlike all other centuries, what was work was defined as labor. And labor is being in a subordinated position, reporting to a boss. It's alienated work. And if you're a feminist, and I hope everybody in this room is a feminist, you realize that this is a fundamentally sexist approach. So that in the 20th century, all work that was not labor disappears from statistics. It disappears from social policy. It disappears from the rhetoric of politicians and trade union leaders. And you can sum it up in a very simple aphorism that was actually said by an economist in the university where I did my PhD, not a radical, Arthur Pigou. He said that when he hires a housekeeper or a cook, national income goes up, employment goes up, economic growth goes up, and unemployment goes down. If he marries her and she continues to do exactly the same work, employment goes down, growth goes down, economic activity goes down, and unemployment rate goes up. Now, you cannot get more stupid than that. And yet, in the 21st century, we still have that model where the politicians and the statisticians are talking like that. And we should challenge them at every possible opportunity, and not just if you're a feminist, because it fundamentally distorts our impressions of what society is all about. Now, I won't go further, you'll be glad to know, on this book. It's a book that takes you 30 years to write, has a lot of detail, and is very boring. But it was coming to terms with what laborism does. It redirects attention away from occupation, away from what it is we do and what it is we would like to do. How to evolve ourselves in the work we do. Instead, it concentrates on labor. Why should we care about labor so much? Actually, it's work that matters. Now, whenever I went and presented this book, and for some reason it led me around the world, there was one subject where whenever I started talking about it, particularly with students, you could hear a pin drop. And that was when I came to talk about the precariat. So I decided at that point to write a second book, which was intended to reach out to non-economists as much as to economists. It's about the precariat. I'll come to it in a minute. And what has happened with that book is it's been translated, I don't know, 15 languages. It's been all over the world. I've been to 200 places because people are interested in the precariat. Something in the water. It's not me, it's something in the subject. And as I did so, I found that I was being attacked by the far left. Many people questioning my parentage, many people questioning my sexuality and all sorts of other things. But at the same time, I was being attacked by the far right. So, you know, if you're being attacked by both, I suppose you feel slightly confident that you may not be all wrong. And then I came to the conclusion of this book, and those of you who have seen it because it's been translated into Portuguese, in the end I posed a politics of inferno, with apologies to Dante, against a politics of paradise. At the moment, we could go either way. And that is where we are at the moment. Well, this last week, the third book in the trilogy has just been published in English, And I don't know what's going to happen because it's only just come out. But what it does is try and take politics of the precariat forward. Now let me come to the narrative that I want to develop. I don't know how many of you are economists, but I'm sure you're all familiar with what happened in the 1980s globally. Essentially, Karl Polanyi's great transformation broke down in the late 1970s and in the early 1980s, and the old model of laborism and welfare state capitalism came unstuck. And we had a period of hegemony by what has become known as neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism has certain qualities that we must all understand. It's not just an insult. I call you a neoliberal and I can feel strong about it. It actually means a body of theory and a perspective, a paradigm, a framework. And of course it meant liberalization, commodification of everything that could be commodified, privatization, and very, very fundamentally, and you can go back to Friedman and Hayek to understand it, the systematic dismantling of all institutions of social solidarity. That was a fundamental part of the neoliberal framework. And as a result, many of the things I'm about to talk about started to happen. But the key fact that we all have to understand is that, historically speaking, almost overnight, very short period, the world's labor supply quadruples, multiplied by 4 times. But all of those extra billion, 2 billion, 2.5 billion workers coming onto the world labor market were habituated and resigned to labor for 1/50th of the wages in the rich industrialized countries. 1/50th. Now, you don't have to be an economist to understand you are going to put huge downward pressure on wages and living standards of workers in richer countries. It's obvious. So what happened at this point is the beginning of what I call in the new book the Great Convergence. The Great Convergence, that as living standards and worker rights and whatever we want to call them go down in the rich countries, they gradually come up in the least developed. And those in the middle, like Brazil, could go either way. You know, you are on the cusp. Now, what happened next is that we have the development of a new model of global capitalism. But this new model is fundamentally about a new system of distribution. It's a system of distribution where rental income goes to a tiny, tiny plutocracy and elite and to financial capital. There is a new book that's just come out, which is getting a lot of reviews, Celebration in the United States, written by a Frenchman, Thomas Piketty, saying that inequality is bound to take place. Huh? He's getting wonderful coverage. Paul Krugman, Joe Stiglitz, they're all saying this is the best thing since cheese was invented. Well, someone should tell these people that capitalism has always tended to produce inequalities, and that global capitalism is producing a plutocracy and rental income. If you have a monopoly over natural resources or patents, last year was the first year in history when over 2 million patents were registered, and over $10 trillion in patent rewards is taking place. This is a huge distribution of rental income. So inequalities are actually much greater than the statistics show. That's the one context. But what has happened to class, to global class structure? Class has not gone away. It's actually become more fragmented. And the argument in these books is that essentially we are witnessing a global class structure being superimposed on national class structures. And the class structure that is taking shape has a plutocracy at the top of global citizens, not the top 1%, the top 0.001%. They're global citizens commodifying politics, pulling people into a very small network, controlling our societies, manipulating and commodifying democracy and so on. Below them is a salariat, people who've still got employment security. But this salariat cannot be put in the old working class because increasingly their income is coming from capital, from shares, from rents, from privilege. So you cannot have the idea of a unified working class like the old Marxist model. It isn't real. And what has happened alongside the salariat, who are making a lot of money, is a group what I call proficients, project-oriented people who have their computer over their shoulder, rushing from airport to airport. I see them every day, making millions of money, but risking burnout and illness at about 28, getting younger. Below those people is the old working class, the old proletariat. Now, Andre Gors, some years ago, some of you will know, said the working class is dead. Actually, it's shrinking. It's not dead. But the whole ethos of laborism was built for the proletariat. And proletarianization meant indoctrinating people to a life of stable labor. 30 years of staggering through full-time labor. Wow, what a life. That was the model that was created in the 20th century, and that group has lost its strength, is shrinking in numbers. And it's beneath them that the precariat is emerging. Now, a lot of my Brazilian friends rush to tell me it ain't the same in Brazil. Brazil has had an increased formalization, and things have got much better, and we're getting a lot low unemployment and so on. And then I wonder, why did all those riots break out across Brazilian cities last year? Maybe Brazil is the one country in the world where the message of the precariat doesn't apply. But I wonder. I don't know. I'm not an expert. But let me tell you what characterizes the precariat. The precariat, first of all, has distinctive relations of production, to use a Marxian term. The relations of production of the precariat are unstable labor, indirect labor, the many forms of flexible labor, some of which are barely understood at the moment, that are spreading, like crowd work and crowd labor, which is growing very rapidly. But there are more important aspects of the precariat than just insecure labor, short-term contracts and all those things. That is, to me, the least interesting aspect of the precariat. It's, if you like, the low-hanging fruit of the definition of the precariat. More interesting, I think, is the fact that people in the precariat have no occupational identity, no occupational narrative that they can give to their lives. The narrative that goes, I am becoming something. I am something. And in retirement, I was something. That narrative, to be able to give to your life, gives you your humanity, because it is central to your character. The precariat knows that it does not have an occupational narrative. And this is fundamentally a source of insecurity and anxiety. But there's something else as well. This is the first class in history where the level of education is greater than the level of labor it is expected to perform. Think about that. It's never happened before. That makes the labor more alienated than it would otherwise be. It is something new. So when people criticize me and say standing is only referring to something that's always been there, they are not understanding the essential character of the precariat. And I think that is very important because it goes with another phenomenon which is found in study after study in rich industrialized countries, which is that social mobility has gone down. It's lower now than it's ever been according to recorded statistics. But the second part of the definition of the precariat is that it has distinctive relations of distribution. What this means is that it has to rely very much on money wages. It doesn't get access to enterprise non-wage benefits, pensions, paid holidays, medical leave, maternity leave, all of these things which give you a sense of security. It doesn't give you that. It doesn't have rights-based social benefits. It becomes supplicants. For me, this quality of the precariat is fundamentally important because people in the precariat are turned into supplicants. What does supplicant mean? It means I have to beg. I have to beg you to help. I have to beg you for favors. I have to beg this charity or this institution. I have to behave properly because you might or might not choose to give me something. This sense of deference. Anybody in the precariat understands that. Yeah, that's exactly how we have to live. But that is a fundamental part of chipping away at your personality. And this leads to a critical part of understanding the precariat. It exists with chronic uncertainty. Uncertainty. It's a particular form of insecurity because unlike the welfare state types of insecurity, you have a probability of unemployment, you have a probability of being sick, you have a probability of being pregnant. With uncertainty, you don't know. You can be hit by a shock, a hazard, just like that. But you don't know when. And this sense of uncertainty is very stressful. It can turn people from being in the precariat one day into being out in the streets very quickly, with complete lack of sustainability. This is a reality of the precariat everywhere. And that is why debt is so fundamental to understanding the precariat. And it goes with this rental type of capitalism. Because increasingly people in the precariat are exploited not only in the workplace, not only outside the workplace doing work that's not counted, but by debt. And we have around the world growth of a frightening phenomenon, which we call payday loans, which are charging people in the precariat thousands of % per month or per year. I chronicle it in the new book. We're talking about millions and millions of Americans, for example, who are having to take out payday loans at extraordinarily high rates of interest out of desperation. And many, of course, can never get escape from debt bondage. stretching years into advance. In brief, the last part of defining the precariat is that the precariat has distinctive relations to the state. What does this mean? It means that for the first time in history, we have an emerging class of people who are losing rights. They're losing cultural rights even in their own societies. They're losing civil rights by being denied the capacity to use the law. They're losing political rights because they're not able to vote or they're not able to see themselves in the political spectrum. They're losing social rights because social rights are being converted into means-tested, behavior-tested, conditional, etc., etc., and they're losing economic rights. The economic right, which includes the right to practice what I'm qualified to do. The right to practice as the person I want to be and believe I am. It's a fundamental economic right which is being denied to millions and millions of people. Now, of course, all these characteristics produce a particular consciousness. A consciousness of a sense of relative deprivation, a sense of anxiety, anomie, alienation, and anger. But to understand the politics that are emerging, we have to understand that at the moment, the precariat is only a class in the making, in the Marxian sense, not yet a class for itself. And what does this mean? It means that people in the precariat are split between the different groups. The first part consists of people who are falling from old working class communities and families and industries. They're often not very educated. They're often unable to understand the dynamics of what is happening, and therefore they become atavistic. And we are seeing in Europe in particular, all over Europe, that this part of the precariat is being lured onto the rocks by populists and neo-fascists, playing racial cards, playing gender cards, playing religious cards, etc. This is a really frightening phenomenon, and you're going to see in the European elections very shortly a huge increase in that neo-fascist tendency. The second variety in the precariat consists of the real denizens, the real people who have no rights, the migrants, the minorities, the different forms of minorities, religious, racial, gender, etc. These people I call nostalgics because they have no sense of home. They have no sense of an anchor to give their lives. These people tend to be politically neutral except when suddenly they feel under threat. I was in Stockholm last year talking about the precariat just at the same time as riots were breaking out all around Stockholm. People used to think that the Swedish model was the ultimate, the nirvana of social democracy. Go to Sweden now and you'll laugh because it's a bad joke, right? And then 4 days of riots by mainly the migrants, realizing that they weren't even citizens of any sort, is part of the phenomenon of the emergence of the precariat. And the third group in the precariat consists of the mainly young, educated, who went to university or college, and they were sold a dream. Go to college, go to university, and you'll come out and you have a career. You will be somebody. But they go to university and they come out with debts. They know where they were sold a lottery ticket that said we might get somewhere. And they realize the lottery ticket is worth less and less. But what the old laborist politicians and the trades unions and the social democrats have not yet understood is that this part of the precariat doesn't want to recreate yesterday. It doesn't want a return to laborism. If you talk to people in the precariat and you say, would you like 30 years in the same job? What? No, anything but. There is a wonderful piece of graffiti which I quote several times in this book because I think it's so powerful. It was on a wall which said, the worst thing would be to return to the old normal. Think about it. It's a powerfully subversive piece of graffiti. Now, this part of the precariat is looking for a future of work. It's looking for a capacity to be a social citizen and a participant in different forms of work. It's wanting to be a full citizen. Now I come, if I've got a few minutes left. Yes?
Yes, but
2 minutes.
I've worried about the precarious situation of several women here. And there are seats here, there, here. May I?
Yes, please, take a seat.
A senhora que está em pé, tem um lugar uma cadeira aqui, tem outra ali, ali tem outra, e há diversas senhoras em pé. I'm sorry, but
No, I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm entirely agree.
You will give them.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. All along I've been talking to an empty seat, so it's much nicer now. But I want to come to the final section, which I think we are at the crisis point of a global transformation in the Polanyian sense. So far, neoliberalism and the period of globalization was the disembedded phase of the global transformation. We are at a crisis point when progressives, particularly young progressives, have to realize what is necessary for a successful transformation. And I believe that the progressive politicians have lost the understanding of what a transformation is all about. There are 3 principles which must be respected. The first principle is that for a new forward march, for a new step towards emancipation and equality, the march must be led by the needs and the aspirations of the emerging mass class. It's not the proletariat, it's the precariat. So unless the politicians and the progressives of our day understand what it is they are searching for, we will not have a new forward march. The second principle is that every new forward march towards more emancipation and towards more equality throughout history has been led by new forms of collective action. New forms of collective action. It will not be the same as the old labor unions of the early 20th century. It will be new forms of associational freedom. But they are only beginning to emerge. And the third principle is that every new forward march involves 3 overlapping struggles. The first struggle is a struggle for recognition, a struggle for identity, a struggle which goes from, instead of seeing myself as a useless human being a failure, I suddenly realize that I am one of a huge crowd. And the crowd I can see in the mirror in the morning. I don't look in the mirror and see a failure. I see a person who belongs to a crowd who are affected by structural factors. That sense of recognition merges into a sense of identity. I am a member of the precariat. And I'm not ashamed, because millions are like me. And that gives me not only personal strength, but the capacity to relate to others and build a movement. Now, what happened in 2011, and since 2011 around the world, all the way including your riots, including Gezi Park in Istanbul, including the Arab Spring, the Indignados, the Italian equivalents, on which I've been involved, everybody started a sense of recognition. Millions of people now identify themselves or can understand the precariat. I'm part of it. That is a necessary first step. But the second struggle is a struggle for representation. A struggle that my interests, the precariat interests, are embedded in the state and in every institution of the state. We have hardly begun that struggle. People in the precariat are still treated as objects, to be reformed, to be punished, to be steered, to be made conditions of, etc. We need a struggle, and we need associations to struggle for representation of the precariat in every part of the state. And the third key struggle is, of course, a struggle for redistribution. But what is it that the precariat wants to see redistributed? It isn't the old socialist project of 100 years ago. If you talk about controlling the means of production to a precariat meeting, they'll all laugh and probably go to the bar. You won't have a very big audience. The struggle is for the key assets of what for a person in the precariat would make a good life and a good society. And in struggling, the precariat will become a transformative class. Because a transformative class is one which struggles to overcome conditions that define it and therefore abolishes itself. Don't know if that can be followed, but it's a very Marxian idea. What are the key assets over which the precariat will struggle? The first is security. Because the inequality in distribution of security in our societies is much greater than the inequality of income. If you're in the salariat or the elite, up here, you have total security. I can buy expertise, I can buy anybody. Never mind what happens in the stock markets, I'll win somewhere else. They have total security. If you're down in the precariat, you have no security at all. Zero. Absolutely zero. You could be hit by a shock tomorrow morning. So security is fundamental, and any policy, and Eduardo will no doubt talk about it, and you'll understand where I'm going here, but any policy should be judged by whether it redistributes security in society and gives people in the bottom and in the precariat a sense of basic security. Because without basic security, you cannot be a citizen. You cannot be a responsible human being. And it's unrealistic and unfair to expect it. The second asset, which is related, is time. Time is a wonderful asset. Control of time is fundamental for having a good life. Again, if you're up here in those upper segments of our class structure, you have control of time. You can choose. If you're down in the precariat, imagine you're a woman with a small baby, rushing between insecurities. You're in debt. You don't know what to do. You have no control over your time. You suffer from what I call in the book the precariatized mind. You don't know what's the best thing to do with your time. If I do this, I might make a mistake. If I do that, so you have no control over time. So any policy should be judged by whether it redistributes control over time. Again, Eduardo will know where I'm going, because that is key. The third great asset over which the precariat will struggle is quality space, the commons, the commons. Now, of course, the neoliberal state has been whittling away at the commons, privatizing, closing public amenities, etc., talking about public-private partnerships, which is only an excuse for privatizing and making profitable. We need to struggle for a revival of the commons, because the precariat depends on living in the commons. It needs the commons more than any other group in society. Public toilets, public parks, public libraries, public amenities, all the great classical aspects of the commons. The next great asset that the precariat cares about is education. Education in our era has been commodified to a disgusting extent. It's preparing people as human capital. It's preparing people to be job seekers, and is whittling away at our cultural capacity to be subversive in our thinking. It's taking away the capacity to be ethical and to develop our moral education, our philosophy, our cultures. All of those things don't help to make you into a commercial. And therefore they're expendable. We need a real struggle to beat the commercialized education systems that have been developed. It is a crisis. And I suggest some policies how that can be done in the book. The next aspect that worries many, many people in the precariat is we need a redistribution of access to financial knowledge. If you're in the upper groups, you can get advisors, you can avoid tax, you can avoid this, you can get extra subsidies, you can do all these things, which gives much more inequality than the original distribution of earnings. If you're down in the precariat, you can't afford that, you don't know it, you make more mistakes, you're likely to be criminalized, and you're likely to face systematic disadvantage. We need a right to financial knowledge and a genuine right which is funded by the state for everybody. That should be a fundamental part of the strategy. It's much more important than it might seem at first glance. And the final thing is we need a struggle for the redistribution of rental capital and financial capital. And here is where, and I won't go into any of the details, might give you some excuse to buy a copy of the book, we need a strategy that involves a new system of distribution. A new system which recognizes a reality of the 21st century, which is that wages will not rise in most of our countries for many, many millions of people. You can put up minimum wages, you can do tax credits, you can have labor subsidies, but the downward pressure, if you're in the precariat, is still there. And if that is a reality, then we need to find mechanisms to redistribute this enormous part of total income that's going to the plutocracy and financial capital. And here, you will not be surprised, Eduardo. We need to find a way of moving towards having a basic income as a universal right to give their security, to increase people's control over their time, to enable them to do work that is not labor, and to find a way of getting better distributive justice. It is a matter of justice, not just anti-poverty, that we need a basic income, just as we need capital funds in order to be able to fund a basic income. I will end with a story. Last year, I was invited, as I said, to an incredible number of places, and one of the places I was invited to was an industrial town of England called Middlesbrough. Probably most of you don't know Middlesbrough. But Middlesbrough was a village in the 1820s, a couple of hundred people. And suddenly they found iron ore in Middlesbrough. And within 15 years, Middlesbrough and the Teesside, the area around it, became the industrial hub of the British Empire and the Industrial Revolution. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco is built with the iron and steel from Middlesbrough. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is built in Middlesbrough. The Indian railway system was built in Middlesbrough. Today, when I went to Middlesbrough, it is a terrible town. Slums, ghettos, sloppish people, houses with concrete blocking the windows, and weeds growing in what were gardens. Now wait. The people of Middlesbrough are the descendants of the people that created the wealth of my country. Today, people in the south of the country are living affluently off the wealth that was created up there. They go to Eton, they become cabinet ministers, they run the country. All of their wealth came from the efforts of those people in places like Middlesbrough. Now, if Thomas Paine was alive today, or Bertrand Russell, I see Bertrand Russell is celebrated here. If they were alive today, they would say, we realize that the wealth of any of us in this room is far more due to the efforts of our forebears than anything you or I can do. And yet I don't know if it was your forebears or my forebears which created our wealth. So out of social justice, should we not have a dividend scheme so that every person in our society has a share in the contribution of our forebears? This is an ethical justification for moving towards some sort of basic income as a right. It's an ethical justification. I will end with that story because every time I think about it, it makes me tearful, because it's close to my heart. Thank you very much for listening.
O senador Suplicy tem que sair em um horário fixo e, portanto, a gente preferiria deixar as perguntas para o final, para dar um espaço para... Oi?
Informa aí que tem o Chico está distribuindo umas revistas do Instituto. Não é de graça, né, Chico? Tem que dar um sorriso em troca.
O Guy Standing está informando que se alguém quer cópias do livro tem que pagar, porque ele pagou por as cópias. Isso.
Você está vendo ali?
Tá. Eu acho que... Ó.
Boa tarde a todos. Quero agradecer muito o convite para estar aqui presente. I would like to thank ao professor Fernando Sarti, ao Anselmo dos Santos, que me convidaram para estar aqui, ao Eduardo Mariucci, Célio Uracata, Pedro Paulo Bastos, Pedro Nossi, Marcelo Proni, Andréa Galvão, ao Carlos Sala, que está nos coordenando os trabalhos. Quero agradecer a presença do Casimiro Brito, que é presidente do PT aqui. Ângelo, o seu nome é o Ângelo. Ângelo, que é também do partido aqui. Então, e queria dizer que está aqui o professor Francisco Nóbrega, que foi professor da USP, hoje das universidades ali do São José dos Campos, mas ele é secretário do primeiro Conselho Municipal da Renda Básica de Cidadania do primeiro município no Brasil que instituiu, por lei, vai instituir por etapas a Renda Básica de Cidadania. I would like to... eu também vou falar inglês para que o professor Geistening possa compreender, so I'll speak in English. And, are you sure? Então, primeiramente, eu gostaria de explicar que o nome do meu livro tem a ver com o professor Geistening. Como é o nome da senhora?
Oh, my name is Sophia.
Oh, your name is Sophia. When you came out from your home the last time, how did you do it? Through the window?
No. No.
How was it?
It was good.
Pardon?
It was good.
No, but how did you came out from your home the last time? Through the window or how?
No. Through the door.
Through the door. That's why the name of my book is Renda de Cidadania, a saída é pela porta, exatamente para demonstrar que, se desejarmos construir uma sociedade justa, prover dignidade e liberdade real para todos, erradicar a pobreza extrema, absoluta, como é o desejo maior da nossa presidenta Dilma, uma solução tão de bom senso quanto sairmos de casa pela porta é instituirmos uma renda básica de cidadania. E o professor Geistening, quando em 98, numa das suas inúmeras visitas ao Brasil, participou no Senado de um simpósio sobre os programas de transferência de renda, de garantia de renda mínima, ele falou sobre isso, e daí porque o meu livro tem esse nome. E quero ver se consigo, para dar bastante tempo para o debate, falar primeiramente que é muito importante que vocês possam, sobretudo aqui, alunos, estudantes de pós-graduação, fazendo mestrado, doutoramento em economia, aprenderem o quanto que essa proposta acompanha a história da humanidade e vem desde os primeiros momentos da história. O mestre Confúcio, no livro das Explicações e das Respostas, observou 520 anos antes de Cristo que a incerteza é ainda pior do que a pobreza. E pode alguém sair de casa senão pela porta? Aristóteles, 300 anos antes de Cristo, em política, observou que a política é a ciência de como alcançar uma vida justa para todos, o bem comum. Para isso é necessário a justiça política, que precisa ser precedida da justiça distributiva, que torna mais iguais aos desiguais. Quem é que sintetizou muito bem isso em 12 palavras em inglês, em 1875, na crítica ao programa de Gotha? John Kenneth Galbraith observa que São 12 palavras que tiveram um efeito ainda mais revolucionário que os volumes de O Capital. From each according to his capacity, to each according to his needs. Karl Marx. Isso ele sintetizou conforme diz a Marilena Chauí, o que estava escrito em Aristóteles. Mas também estes mesmos princípios estão nos fundamentos de todas as religiões. Qual a palavra no Antigo Testamento da Bíblia Sagrada mais citada? 513 vezes, me ensinou o Rabino Henry Sobel. Tzedakah, T-Z-E-D-A-K, que em hebraico significa justiça social, justiça na sociedade. Então, no livro de Davi, de Deuteronômio, dos Provérbios, do Êxodo, sempre está ali a palavra tzedakah. Não é à toa que o MST, nos seus seminários, muitas vezes começa com o livro do Êxodo, para lembrar da luta pela terra prometida, pela reforma agrária, por justiça na sociedade. Se formos ao Novo Testamento, ali estão os Atos dos Apóstolos, que juntaram todos os seus bens, passaram a viver em comunidade de maneira a prover a cada um de acordo com as suas necessidades. As parábolas de Jesus, como do Senhor da vinha, observam que o Senhor da vinha contratou inúmeros trabalhadores ao longo da jornada, na primeira hora, na segunda, até a última hora do dia. Com cada um contratou o que ambos consideravam justo. Ao final, começou o pagamento pelo último que ali chegou, e ali, quando pagou ao primeiro, este lhe perguntou: mas como assim o senhor está me pagando o mesmo que ao último que aqui chegou? Eu trabalhei mais do que ele. Ora, você não percebe que eu estou lhe pagando o mesmo que ambos consideramos justo e que o último que chegou aqui também precisa receber o suficiente para o sustento da sua família? E se formos observar o que nos diz São Paulo aos Coríntios, ele observa que devemos sempre seguir o exemplo de Jesus, que, em sendo tão poderoso, resolveu se solidarizar e viver dentre os mais pobres, de tal maneira que, conforme está escrito, para que haja justiça, para que haja igualdade, toda aquela pessoa que teve uma safra abundante não tenha de mais, toda aquela pessoa que teve uma safra pequena não tenha de menos. Um dia eu estava explicando esse projeto para as comunidades eclesiais de base, as pastorais da terra, na CNBB, e o saudoso Dom Luciano Mendes de Almeida me disse: Eduardo, você não precisa citar Karl Marx para defender a sua proposta, que ela é muito melhor defendida por São Paulo na segunda epístola aos Coríntios. Daí eu sempre cito os dois. Mas se formos olhar os ensinamentos dos que seguem o Alcorão, Maomé, os 4 califas que escreveram o livro dos Hadis, Omar, o segundo deles, ele diz que toda aquela pessoa que detém um grande patrimônio deve destinar uma parcela deste patrimônio para os que pouco ou nada têm. E se formos olhar os ensinamentos do budismo, o Dalai Lama, na Ética para um Novo Milênio, diz que, se for para aceitar o consumo tão suntuoso dos mais ricos, precisamos antes assegurar a sobrevivência de toda a humanidade. Se formos um pouco mais adiante, na história, 1516, eu os convido todos. You know, Guy, that where the 16th International Congress of Bien will be held, no? Montreal, no. This is the 50th, the next one.
No, it's not decided yet.
But it is almost decided. No, you know where it is. What is the reason for, in 2016, to make the Basic Income Earth Network happen in a very special place? And why? por causa dos 500 anos de utopia de Thomas Paine, que viveu em Louvain. It will be in Louvain, because of the 500 years of utopia. Didn't you know that? It's a proposal. So I'm inviting all of them to be in Louvain for our Young Congress. Mas, e por que razão? Vocês sabem que em Utopia, no livro primeiro, estava o Rafael Iptilodeu, viajante português, conversando com o cardeal arcebispo e outro personagem, e estavam discutindo a pena de morte que, instituída na Inglaterra, não havia contribuído para acabar com a criminalidade violenta, diminuir os assaltos, roubos, assassinatos. E então, eis que Rafael Iptilodeu diz que muito mais eficaz do que infligir estes castigos horríveis, aqui não tem outra alternativa senão de primeiro tornar-se um ladrão para daí ser transformado em cadáver, é você assegurar a sobrevivência das pessoas. E com base nesta reflexão, um amigo dele, Juan Luiz Vives, escreveu para o prefeito da cidade flamenga de Bruges, um pouco depois, um tratado de subvenção aos pobres, onde pela primeira vez propôs a garantia de uma renda para a população. E podemos seguir um pouco mais adiante para nos encontrarmos com outro Thomas, um dos maiores ideólogos das revoluções americana e francesa, que foi Thomas Paine. Em 1795, ele observou em Justiça Agrária, que está aqui traduzida para o português em 20 páginas, que a pobreza é algo que tem a ver com a civilização e a instituição da propriedade privada. Ali na América, onde ele tinha estado, antes da independência, não via tamanha destituição e pobreza quanto nas vilas e cidades europeias. Então, por quê? Porque lá a propriedade era comum dentre os índios. Mas ele considerava de bom senso que uma pessoa que cultive a terra, realize uma benfeitoria na terra, possa usufruir de seu trabalho nas filósofos, economistas do mais largo espectro passaram a falar e a propor a garantia de uma renda, seja através de um imposto de renda negativo, como, por exemplo, George Stigler, Milton Friedman, Ava Lerner, John Robinson, por exemplo, propôs que todos os sábados se distribuísse uma libra esterlina para cada cidadão, e John Maynard Keynes, 1939, em How to Pay for the War, escreveu que a Inglaterra precisava se preparar para a guerra, então precisava separar uma parcela do orçamento para a defesa, mas como iria haver problemas sociais, deveria destinar pelo menos 2% do PIB de então, de 5 bilhões de libras esterlinas, 100 milhões de libras esterlinas, para pagar uma renda básica para a população. Mas também o Friedrich von Hayek, o Milton Friedman, James Tobin, quer dizer, tanto os defensores do sistema monetarista ou de mercado, mas até os keynesianos que criticaram Milton Friedman, como James Tobin, John Kenneth Galbraith e o Paul Samuelson e tantos outros, passaram a defender a garantia de uma renda mínima através de um imposto de renda negativo, mas o próprio James Tobin, em 1972, ao assessorar George McGovern, propôs que ele instituísse um demo grant da ordem de $1.000 em 1972, seria mais de $10.000 hoje para cada cidadão norte-americano, só que George McGovern não conseguiu explicar bem, não havia ainda bien, e pessoas como Guy Stanning, Philippe Van Pares e outras que hoje defendem tão claramente a proposta. E, bem, isto foi evoluindo, mas mais e mais depois de 1986, quando Guy Stanning, Philippe Van Pares Klaus Hoff, Robert van der Veen e tantos outros passaram a defender, criaram a BIAN e passaram a defender uma renda básica incondicional, eu mesmo fiquei persuadido de que melhor do que um programa de garantia de renda mínima associado às oportunidades, através de um imposto de renda negativo, ou mesmo associado às oportunidades de educação, seria melhor tornar a renda básica um direito universal e incondicional para todos. Mas, antes mesmo de eu conhecer este conceito, eu, muito amigo de Antônio Maria da Silveira, que foi um dos, talvez o primeiro proponente no Brasil de uma renda básica garantida, de uma renda mínima garantida para todos, através de um imposto de renda negativo. Então, quando me tornei senador, em 90, convidei-o para comigo elaborar o primeiro projeto de garantia de renda mínima, através de um imposto de renda negativo. Quem não recebesse um certo patamar de renda passaria a ter o direito de receber um complemento, uma proporção, tipo 50% da diferença entre aquele patamar e o nível de renda da pessoa. O projeto foi aprovado no Senado Federal em dezembro de 91, mas já naquele ano, em agosto de 91, num simpósio com 50 economistas do PT, coordenados pelo então Walter Barelli, do governo paralelo de Lula, em Belo Horizonte, eu expus com Antônio Maria da Silveira a proposta, e o economista professor José Marcos Camargo, da PUC do Rio de Janeiro, disse: Eduardo, é uma boa ideia, mas você precisaria pensar que seria interessante se iniciar a garantia de uma renda mínima para as famílias carentes, desde que as suas crianças estivessem indo à escola, porque o problema importante no Brasil é que há um número tão grande de famílias tão carentes que fazem as suas crianças, desde os 7, 8, 9, 10 anos de idade, irem para o trabalho, não vão à escola e, com isso, depois, ao chegar à idade adulta, não têm a formação suficiente. Então, se você prover a garantia de uma renda para essas famílias, desde que as crianças estejam indo à escola, então você vai cortar um dos círculos viciosos da pobreza. José Márcio Camargo escreveu na Folha, dezembro de 91, um artigo expondo essa proposta, outra vez em 93, e então, aqui em Campinas, o prefeito José Roberto Magalhães Teixeira, do PSDB, no Distrito Federal, o governador eleito Cristóvão Buarque, ambos iniciaram em 95 as primeiras experiências de garantia de renda mínima associadas às oportunidades de educação, que também vieram a se chamar Bolsa Escola. Depois veio o Bolsa Alimentação, o Auxílio Gás, no início do governo Lula, o Cartão Alimentação. Quando chegou outubro de 2003, no governo Lula, 10º mês de governo, a sua equipe resolveu unificar e racionalizar aqueles 4 programas que eu citei naquilo que é o Bolsa Família. Nesses últimos 10 anos e pouco, tivemos uma evolução muito significativa. O Bolsa Família, em dezembro de 2003, beneficiava 3,5 milhões de famílias. A cada ano foi aumentando, 4,5 milhões, 5 milhões, 6 milhões e tal. Hoje são 14.130.000 famílias, pelo último dado, que correspondem, se multiplicarmos por 3,5 pessoas por família, a aproximadamente 50 milhões de pessoas, 1/4 da população brasileira, recebe a garantia de uma renda mínima. Todos vocês que no Instituto de Economia da Unicamp sabem descrever assim, todos aqui sabem todas as regras do programa Bolsa Família? Qualquer um deles sabe dizer? Não, eu preciso saber. Sim ou não?
Eu creio que não. Todas não.
Vou tentar explicar rapidamente. Toda família no Brasil, se a sua renda familiar per capita não atingir pelo menos R$ 140 por mês, passa a ter o direito ao benefício do Bolsa Família. Se a renda familiar per capita não atingir sequer R$ 70 por mês, então o benefício começa com R$ 70 para a família, mais 32, 64, 96, 128 ou R$ 160 se a família tiver 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ou mais crianças até 15 anos de 11 meses, mais 38 e mais 38 se na família tiver 1 ou 2 adolescentes, 16 a 18 anos. Há condicionalidades. A mãe, se estiver grávida, deve fazer o pré-natal na rede pública de saúde até que nasça o nenê, para ver como está evoluindo a sua saúde do nenê. Os pais devem levar as crianças até 6 anos de idade na rede pública para verificar para fazer as vacinas de acordo com o calendário do Ministério da Saúde. As crianças de 7 a 15 anos de 11 meses precisam frequentar pelo menos 85% das aulas, os adolescentes pelo menos 75% das aulas. Desde 2011, a presidenta Dilma lançou a busca ativa. Os governos estaduais, municipais, nós, parlamentares, cidadãos, organizações empresariais de trabalhadores, nós, se soubermos de alguma família que, porventura, receba até R$ 140 per capita ou menos, e não estiver inscrita ainda no Bolsa Família, é nosso dever informar, a senhora vai, ou o senhor vai lá na Secretaria Municipal de Desenvolvimento Social e se inscreva, porque você tem o direito de receber. E, então, tem aumentado o número de famílias que estão ingressando no programa Bolsa Família ao longo destes anos, mas ainda não se completou 100%. Hoje, no Brasil, são mais de 201 milhões de habitantes. O total de famílias cadastradas com renda per capita mensal até R$ 140, em janeiro de 2014, chegava a 18.755.294 famílias. Dessas, estavam inscritas no programa Bolsa Família, o último dado, coletado hoje de manhã, no MDS, Ministério do Desenvolvimento Social, abril de 2014, 14.145.274 famílias, que corresponde a quase 50 milhões de habitantes, 1/4 da nossa população. Mas ainda são 75,42% das famílias. Faltam 24,25% para que todas que têm o direito, segundo a lei, venham a receber. Talvez vocês tivessem interesse, por exemplo, em saber, aqui em Campinas, em janeiro de 2014, havia 42.277 famílias que ganhavam até R$ 140, e dessas, 26.216, ou 62%, é que estão sendo beneficiadas. Falta 38%. No estado de São Paulo, a proporção está em 67,93%. No município de São Paulo, onde o prefeito Fernando Haddad resolveu avançar significativamente, de 547.558 famílias em janeiro de 2014, 374.153 no dia de hoje, nos dados do MDS para abril, estão inscritas, correspondendo a 68,18%. O programa Bolsa Família, desde 2002, 2003 até para cá, fez com que o Brasil, que, digamos, em 1996 tinha um coeficiente Gini de 0,61, quase 63, estávamos dentre os 3 países mais desiguais do mundo. A Namíbia estava com 0,74, era o mais desigual. Em 2002, estávamos com o coeficiente Gini, que vocês conhecem bem, da ordem de 0,59. Ano a ano foi diminuindo, tanto a pobreza extrema quanto o coeficiente Gini de desigualdade. O último, que é de 2012, foi 0,51 aproximadamente. Progredimos bastante em diminuir a desigualdade, mas ainda somos o 16º ou 7º mais desigual país do mundo. Como avançar? Dentre as proposições, claro, realizar melhor a reforma agrária, prover boa educação para todos, boa assistência à saúde, Minha Casa Minha Vida, expandir, etc. Todos os programas de inclusão social, mas... E o programa Bolsa Família avançou e muito. Sou super favorável a tudo que aconteceu. Mas eu tenho escrito à presidenta Dilma, e anteontem tive uma reunião de 45 minutos com a ministra Tereza Campelo e com o ministro da Casa Civil, porque quero propor à presidenta Dilma, já escrevi para ela, sugerindo que ela crie um grupo de trabalho para estudar as etapas em direção à renda básica de cidadania. Sabem vocês que já é lei, pois nos anos 90, mais e mais interagindo com Guy Stanley, Felipe Vampares e os demais membros da BIA, eu fiquei persuadido de que, melhor ainda do que um imposto de renda negativo, e com condicionalidades como Bolsa Família, será avançarmos na direção de uma renda básica incondicional. Escrevi a proposta, apresentei ao Senado em abril de 2002, quando saiu a primeira edição desse livro. Relator Francelino Pereira, 81 anos, ex-presidente da Arena, ex-governador de Minas, um homem experiente, estudou o livro e disse: Eduardo, é uma boa ideia, mas você precisa torná-la compatível com a lei de responsabilidade fiscal. Para cada despesa é preciso haver a receita correspondente. Eu aceitei, então, a proposta que ele me fez. Vamos colocar um parágrafo que diga que a renda básica de cidadania igual para todos, incondicional, será instituída por etapas a critério do Poder Executivo, começando pelos mais necessitados. Eu me lembrei, então, daquilo que um dos grandes prêmios nobres de economia, James Edward Mead, explicou na sua trilogia A Gatotopia. Por longo tempo ele esteve em busca de utopia. Por mais que navegasse, não conseguiu encontrá-la. No caminho de volta, deparou-se com a gatotopia, que em grego quer dizer um bom lugar. E então, ali tornou-se amigo de um economista que lhe disse: nós, agatotopianos, sabemos onde é que fica a utopia, mas não vamos lhe contar, porque lá em utopia eles são seres humanos perfeitos que construíram um lugar perfeito, enquanto que nós aqui somos seres humanos imperfeitos que cometemos as nossas bobagens e perfídias. Você comete às vezes alguma bobagem? Hoje muito. Então, mas ainda assim conseguimos construir um bom lugar. E o James Mead, então, estudou aquelas instituições e ficou persuadido de que eram as melhores que até então havia conhecido para, simultaneamente, alcançar 3 objetivos que a humanidade e os economistas muito queriam alcançar simultaneamente. Liberdade, no sentido de cada pessoa poder trabalhar naquilo que deseja e gastar o que recebe no que quiser. Igualdade, no sentido de não haver grandes disparidades de renda e de riqueza, e de alcançar o maior padrão de vida possível, com os recursos e tecnologias vigentes. E quais eram as instituições? Primeiro, flexibilidade de preços e de salários para a boa alocação dos recursos. Segundo, muita interação entre trabalhadores e empresários, se possível, trabalhadores serem contratados por participação nos resultados, Labor Quota Partnership, mas se você tivesse, então, flexibilidade para os salários eventualmente descerem e participação nos resultados, e às vezes por causa de inundações, fenômenos climáticos, secas, tsunamis, terremotos, etc., você poderia, ou fenômenos internacionais, poderia haver um declínio da atividade. Então, para resolver o problema da pobreza e prover igualdade, seria necessário a renda de cidadania. Mas no último capítulo, James Edward Mead, que viveu de 1907 a 1995 e viu todas as guerras, revoluções, golpes de Estado ocorrendo no século XX, observou no final do livro que o importante é saber aonde se quer chegar e caminhar firmemente naquela direção. Porque se você quiser ir de uma hora para outra, ocorrem todos esses problemas. Então eu lembrei disso e falei para o Francilino Pereira, tá bom, eu aceito. E graças a este parágrafo foi aprovada pelo Senado em dezembro de 2002, por todos os partidos, dezembro de 2003, todos os partidos, na Câmara, e foi ao presidente Lula. Eu expliquei ao Antônio Palocci, ministro da Fazenda, que disse ao presidente Lula, como é para ser instituído por etapas, gradualmente é factível, pode sancionar. O presidente Lula sancionou em 8 de janeiro de 2004. Faz 10 anos e pouco. O que é que falta? Os professores e os estudantes da Unicamp escreverem, como eu já fiz e outros estão fazendo, uma carta à presidenta Dilma, inclusive ao professor da Unicamp, aqui do Instituto de Economia, o Luiz Mercadante, porque anteontem ele me falou, mas Eduardo, é impossível, imagine, o Bolsa Família custa 25 bilhões, e se você for pagar R$70 para cada pessoa, para começar modestamente, 201 milhões, vai custar 168 milhões. A ministra Tereza Campoelo falou, bom, isso vai ser o que se gasta em saúde mais educação, nós não temos isso. Eu sei, não dá para uma hora para outra, mas se vocês acharem uma boa ideia, quem sabe possam constituir um grupo de trabalho para estudar como chegar à renda básica de cidadania. Isso desde que vocês compreendam bem quais as vantagens de se pagarem incondicionalmente a todos. Mas como? Até os professores da Unicamp, até o prefeito de Campinas, ou ao governador Alckmin, a presidenta Dilma, ao presidente Lula, a Xuxa, ao Pelé, ao senador Suplicy, sim. Obviamente, os que temos mais, contribuiremos para que todos nós e todos os demais venham a receber. Que vantagens há? Primeiro, suponhamos que vocês escrevam a carta à presidenta Dilma e ela fique persuadida e, não agora, neste ano, mas em dezembro de 2016, na véspera da nova visita do Papa Francisco, em 2017 prevista, ela então anuncia em dezembro de 2016. A partir de janeiro de 2017, todas as pessoas no Brasil, não importa a origem, raça, sexo, idade, condição civil ou socioeconômica, passaremos todos a ter o direito de receber a cada mês, para começar, R$70 por mês, que é o quanto que o Bolsa Família mais o Brasil Carinhoso estavam garantindo, para os mais pobres, para ser melhor, até para os beneficiários do Bolsa Família. Mas um dia vai ser 100, um dia vai ser 200, um dia 500, um dia 1000, mais e mais, com o progresso da nação. Lhes pergunto, para explicar o Bolsa Família, eu precisei de 2, 3 minutos. Para explicar a renda básica de cidadania, foi menos de 1 minuto, não é isso? E o que foi mais fácil de compreender? Mais fácil de compreender a renda básica de cidadania ou as regras do programa Bolsa Família? A renda básica. Primeira vantagem, é mais fácil de todos compreenderem. Segundo, eliminamos toda e qualquer burocracia envolvida em se ter que saber quanto cada um ganha no mercado formal ou informal, carteira de trabalho ou em qualquer atividade, informalmente na rua. Eliminamos qualquer estigma ou sentimento de vergonha de uma pessoa precisar dizer eu só recebo tanto, por isso mereço tal complemento. Eliminamos o fenômeno da dependência que acontece quando tem um sistema que diz que não recebe até certo patamar, tem o direito de receber tal complemento. E a pessoa está por decidir, vou ou não iniciar essa atividade que vai me render esse tanto. Mas se eu iniciá-la, receber esse tanto, e daí vem o governo e me retira o que eu estava recebendo naquele programa, eu talvez desisto e entro na armadilha da pobreza ou do desemprego. Mas se todos iniciarmos da renda básica em diante, sempre haverá o estímulo ao progresso. Ah, mas imagine, o senador Suplicy quer pagar uma renda básica até para quem não esteja trabalhando e nem queira trabalhar se receber a renda básica. Será que não vai estimular a ociosidade? O que é que vamos fazer com aquelas pessoas que têm uma tendência inarredável à vagabundagem? Tem alguém com essa tendência aqui? Levante a mão. Venho aqui já. Como é o seu nome?
Lucas.
Lucas. Ô Lucas, vocês acham que se o Lucas tiver uma tendência inarredável à vagabundagem, ele estaria aqui conversando conosco sobre como melhorar o Brasil? Olha, Lucas, veja só, você está querendo... Como? Então, veja bem, pensemos em... Todos nós, seres humanos, homens e mulheres, amamos fazer uma série de atividades, mesmo sem remuneração no mercado. As mães, quando estão amamentando seus nenês, qualquer hora do dia, da noite, da madrugada. Nós, pais e mães, quando estamos cuidando de nossas crianças, para que bem se desenvolvam, para que possam ter melhor educação, alimentação. Quando nossos pais e avós são mais velhos, precisam do nosso carinho, atenção, damos. Nas associações de bairros, nas igrejas de todas as denominações, nos centros e diretórios acadêmicos, quantos de nós não realizamos tantas atividades porque nos sentimos úteis? Quando Vincent van Gogh e Amedeo Modigliani eram pintores e queriam ganhar a sua sobrevivência, vender as suas obras nas ruas, mal conseguiam. Ambos ficaram doentes, morreram precocemente, hoje as suas obras são vendidas por milhões de dólares. Você conhece bem a Constituição brasileira, assegura o direito à propriedade privada, o que significa que aquela pessoa que detém a propriedade de fábrica, de fazenda, de hotel, de restaurante, de títulos financeiros, de bancos, de propriedades imobiliárias, pode receber juros, lucros, aluguéis. E, por acaso, o dono do capital, para receber juros, lucros e aluguéis, precisa necessariamente demonstrar que esteja trabalhando? Precisa necessariamente demonstrar que as suas crianças e os seus adolescentes estejam indo à escola? Não. Então, se asseguramos aos mais ricos o direito de receber tais rendimentos sem aquelas condicionalidades, por que não estendermos a todos, ricos e pobres, o direito de todos participarmos da riqueza comum de nossa nação, ainda mais quando pensamos em certos aspectos da nossa história? Por mais de 3 séculos, milhões de pessoas foram arrancadas de sua terra natal na África para aqui virem colaborar com a acumulação de capital de tantas famílias, sem receberem, senão, o direito de viver numa senzala e receberem uma alimentação que fazia com que os escravos tivessem uma expectativa de vida pouco superior a 30 anos de idade. Ou então, quando pensamos em aspectos do Brasil moderno, o presidente Lula costumava dizer, parece que Deus é brasileiro, veio morar no Brasil, ajudou a Petrobras a encontrar no fundo do Oceano Atlântico enorme reserva petrolífera que vai possibilitar de todos podermos erradicar completamente a pobreza absoluta e elevar o grau de educação, progresso científico, tecnológico e cultural do Brasil para todos. Será que não é de bom senso? Então, está convencido já? Obrigado. Mas, Lucas, não contei ainda a principal vantagem da renda básica, the most important advantage of the basic income. É do ponto de vista da dignidade e da liberdade do ser humano, de que nos fala Amartya Sen em desenvolvimento como liberdade, que desenvolvimento, se for para valer, deve significar maior grau de liberdade para todos. Para aquela jovem que, por falta de alternativa, não tem outro meio de alcançar a sobrevivência senão de vender o seu corpo, ou o personagem, digamos, dos Racionais MCs, do Homem na Estrada, que também, pela falta de alternativa, resolve se tornar o aviãozinho da quadrilha de narcotraficantes. O dia que houver a renda básica para estas pessoas e para todas na sua família, essas pessoas vão ganhar o direito de dizer, não, agora eu não vou aceitar essa única alternativa que vai ferir a minha dignidade, colocar minha saúde e vida em risco. Agora eu posso aguardar um tempo, posso, e porque todos na minha família têm como sobreviver, até, quem sabe, fazer um curso aqui em Campinas, na Unicamp, até que surja uma oportunidade mais de acordo com a minha vocação, com a minha vontade. É nesse sentido, pois, que a renda básica de cidadania significará extraordinário salto de qualidade. Eu poderia aqui me estender mais e lhes falar de como, e recomendo a todos vocês que leiam os livros de Guy Stanley, de Philippe Van Parijs, Klaus Hoff e todos, como, por exemplo, o Philippe Van Parijs explica que se desejarmos efetivamente colocar em prática os princípios de justiça de John Rawls, de igual liberdade, de diferença, de igualdade de oportunidades, melhor ainda do que propõe John Rawls um imposto de renda negativo, uma garantia para prover a renda mínima, melhor será a incondicionalidade por causa de todos estes fatores que mencionei. De maneira que, já falei demais, eu queria só estimular todos vocês, professores e estudantes da Unicamp. Eu queria, acho que estão aqui cerca de 9 ou 10 professores. Aos professores eu darei o meu livro Renda de Cidadania, Saída pela Porta, para cada um. Para os demais eu estou dando a cartilha que o Geraldo fez, Uma História Feliz para Todos, onde ele sintetiza. Eu encontrei o Geraldo algum tempo atrás, dei o meu livro e falei, eu queria muito que você pudesse explicar ao povo numa cartilha o que é. Ele falou, Eduardo, eu gosto muito de você e da proposta, escreva uma carta para as crianças, explicando o que é, e me mande, que eu vou lhe dar de presente. Eu escrevi uma carta para os meus netos, eram 5, agora já 6, de 4 a 11 anos, ele me mandou, eu li para os meus netos em 4 minutos, vovô, compreendi tudo. Aí eu falei para ele que fiquei super contente, por isso que eu pedi ao Senado para imprimir, eu tenho direito de fazer, porque se trata de projeto de lei que apresentei e aprovado. Então, se tiverem achado uma boa ideia, ainda mais com tudo aquilo que o Guy Stanley vai lhes explicar, escrevam à presidenta Dilma seriamente para que ela possa instituir o grupo de trabalho para estudar como e quando, e quem sabe vocês propõem até os economistas. Eu citei, quem quiser ver a minha última palestra, eu vou deixar aqui, mas vou lhe mandar por e-mail para todos vocês terem acesso à mesma. O que eu falei é uma síntese do que está aqui, do que está no livro, mas essa é a última palestra que eu tenho apresentado, inclusive para o Congresso Internacional da BIAN, que se realizará em Montreal em 26 a 29 de junho próximo. E todos que, porventura, querem fazer tese de mestrado e de doutoramento sobre esses temas, que o Guy sobre o precariado e a renda básica de cidadania, só salientar no precariado, conforme o Guy Stanley aqui colocou, uma das principais propostas para resolver o problema do precariado, por ele analisado, é de justamente instituir a renda básica de cidadania em cada um dos países. Mas ele não falou ainda, eu quero sugerir que ele explique para vocês as experiências locais que ele estimulou que acontecessem na Namíbia, na vila de Otiveiro, onde por 3 anos se pagou uma renda básica numa vila de 1.000 pessoas, e a experiência que nesses últimos 3 anos ocorreu nas vilas da província de Madhya Pradesh, onde a Self-Employment Women Organization, com o apoio da Unicef e orientação e coordenação do professor Guy Stanning, 6.000 pessoas por 2 anos receberam uma renda básica igual para os seus 6.000 habitantes de 8 vilas. Comparou-se a 12 outras vilas, onde 6.000 habitantes não receberam, e ele pode lhes contar quais foram os resultados tão positivos dessa experiência. Ou seja, o Guy Stanning, além de ser um intelectual, é também um pesquisador que vai a campo e realiza pesquisas dessa profundidade. And I have just one question, that you relate to them the results of both the Otiverio experience in Namibia and the Madhya Pradesh experience in India. This is my question for you to tell to them all, okay? Muito obrigado, um beijo, um abraço para vocês.
Bom, agradecemos ao senador Suplicy a apresentação que ele fez e abrimos o espaço para perguntas do público. Por favor, se alguém tiver uma pergunta, seria interessante que se identifique, porque está sendo gravado o conteúdo da palestra. Fala em português, eu traduzo para ele.
Oi, está dando para ouvir? Então, eu teria 2 questões. Desculpa. Eu sou Pedro, sou estudante do mestrado em Sociologia, aqui da Unicamp. Estudo Sociologia do Trabalho. Então, eu tenho 2 questões. A primeira é quanto à diferença que ele faz no início da fala dele entre trabalho e labor. Se essa diferenciação tem algo a ver com a diferenciação feita por Hannah Arendt em A Condição Humana entre trabalho e labor, que ela faz essa mesma diferença. E a segunda questão é quando ele vai falar do que seria uma espécie de programa político do precariado, em que isso se diferenciaria de um simples programa social-democrata de retorno ao welfare state, o estado de bem-estar social.
Well, thank you very much for the question. May I begin by making a plea that you don't impoverish me today, because I bought the copies of the book and I have to pay the publisher for the money, and I see all of the books seem to have gone, so please pay me, otherwise I'm going to be in debt and closer to the precariat. It's 50 reais the charter book in English, and 39 the Portuguese. So that might put people off and put them back. But please, if you would afterwards, I'd be grateful. Now, there are 2 points. One, Eduardo, do you want me to answer Eduardo's question and then I come to this? As Eduardo said, I've been very privileged to be involved in 2 basic income pilots. One we launched in Namibia, which was a small pilot, but what we saw when people in very poor villages were given a basic income, and we monitored it over 2 years, was nutrition improved, schooling improved, women's economic status improved, crime went down, and inequality went down. We've then been doing it in India, where we've been doing what's called a randomized controlled trial, where you provide every man, every woman, every child with a basic income paid each month, and you compare what happens to them with other people in other villages who are not given the basic income. And over the 2 years we've been doing it, some of the effects bring tears to my eyes. The first thing that we saw was that child malnutrition fell dramatically. The WHO has an index which is called the Z score, if anybody knows this, which measures a child's weight for age, and it's a normal distribution, all right? And it's based on world standards. Any poor area, it is skewed to the left. The distribution is skewed to the left because you've got a lot of people, a lot of children who have low weight for their age. And in places like India, the girls are even more skewed to the left because they are left to the last for the food and the health care and the treatment. Well, Mozart started to play in my ears when, after we had weighed all the children before we started the basic income, we didn't tell them to do anything with their money. It's up to them. And then after 6 months, they were weighed again. And after 6 more months, they were weighed again. And remarkably, the distribution of the Z scores becomes normal. But what is even more beautiful is we saw a bigger improvement for the girls than for the boys. So actually, at the end of the experiment, the distribution for girls was slightly better than for boys. And this was partly because the basic income was individualized, and for the mothers got it for the children, all right? So that their voice became stronger. But we've also seen improvement in schooling, improvement in school performance, and a big change in the pattern of economic activity. And this is going to come to your question. Because one of the most dramatic changes was that women's work and activities increased much more than men's. And increasingly what happened was people shifted from bonded labor and casual wage labor to own account work, work for themselves, work on their own farm, work a little shop, sewing, selling things. And the activities in those villages have been transformational. But the point I want to make, and this is something I believe is new in our thinking about basic income, is that the emancipatory value of the basic income is greater than the monetary value. I let that sink in. Because what happened in these villages, because I couldn't understand why a small amount should have such dramatic effects. But what happened was that people had liquidity. Money is a scarce resort in many rural areas of the world. It's money that is controlled by the landlords and by the moneylenders, and therefore they have a monopoly. And having a monopoly enables them to charge ridiculously high rates of interest. It's the same with the precariat. The money lenders can extract income from people. But once you have a little liquidity, you not only have the emancipation of being able to deal with it, but if necessary, you can borrow from your relatives, your friends, your neighbors to deal with a crisis. So what we saw is the only group of people complaining in these Indian villages about our pilot are the moneylenders. I'm surprised, but delighted. So the emancipation in those villages has been tremendous. And the confidence and the investments and the dynamics. If you go to those villages like I did 3 weeks ago, tears, you cry. Because it's transforming. It's transformed their lives. It's this power. Now to come to your question. Work is not labor. You go back to ancient Greece, which as I discuss in these books, labor was done by the banosai, the non-citizens. It is alienated activity done in subordination for the other. You are alienated and subordinated. But the person who wanted to do work was what you did around the home with your family and friends. It's reproductive activity. It's the activity of reproducing ourselves and developing ourselves through what we do. And the ancient Greeks were much wiser than we are in this regard, because not only did they differentiate between work, which has use value in a Marxian sense, whereas labor has exchange value, but they also understood we needed to differentiate between play, recuperation, activities that are relaxing, and skole, the activity of participating in the life of the polis, in the agora, in the public spaces. And Pericles had a brilliant idea back in 450 BC. Do you know what Pericles did? He said, look, you citizens, and we know it was a sexist society, had slaves, it wasn't a good society, I'm not defending it, but the principle was understandable. Pericles said, every citizen should receive an amount of money. We could call it a basic income. In return for the fact that they are participating in the political life of our community. It is a compensation for their time and effort. It's not a condition. They are able to do it, and therefore the state should compensate them as citizens. I think that's a powerful idea, but it stems from understanding the difference of time. All right? You mentioned Hannah Arendt. I think her book, The Human Condition, is one of the great books of the 20th century. I think it's a fundamental text. I disagree with some parts of it, but it's a wonderful book. All right? And the differentiation between her idea of labor and work and human action is still fundamental. But it is fundamental for all of us to rescue work and leisure, real leisure, from labor and play. And we all should be respected. I think that's the position I would like to take. And it leads you logically, one step after the other, to the sort of thing that Eduardo and I have been talking about giving people a right to a basic security in which they can make rational decisions about how they develop themselves in their work. And I think that's where we should go in the 21st century.
I need to apologize. Eu preciso fazer uma palestra em Lorena, na Universidade Salesiana, às 7 horas da noite, e está na última hora para os amigos de licença.
Muito obrigado,
Parabéns,
senador.
congratulations.
Muito obrigado, senador. Nós temos duas perguntas aqui. Mario.
It's fine. My question is to guys standing. I must state up front that my submission is from a labor perspective. Now, I think there's a number of areas that one can accept the point that you are advancing. There are also a number of areas, as you had pointed out in your introductory statement, people will differ with. Now, I think there would be an inherent danger to create an understanding, and certainly an ideological understanding, that what you refer to as the precariat can constitute itself into being a homogeneous class. There would be a danger in doing so for the simple reason. Much of what you articulate to be the issues facing the precariat are no different to issues facing the proletariat as we know it today. What we should be cautious about is not to define the proletariat to be those people that are engaged in active employment. The proletariat by its very nature are constituted by the unemployed, it's constituted by workers, whether they form part of the formal economy, or as we now refer to them as atypical form of employment, whether it's part of landless people movements, student movements being at university, or any other forms. Those would be what we constitute to be the proletariat. Indifferently, the working class. Professors traditionally were never part of the trade union movement. Nowadays you see an emergence of professors even joining the trade unions because they could identify with the causes that ordinary workers identify themselves with. And that is, they are selling their labor in exchange for money, for earnings. So one should be hesitant to classify or declassify what is already part of the existing conditions between the proletariat in the sense we understand it or should understand it, and what you refer to as the precariat. My submission would simply be to say that what we are beginning to experience is the fact that the proletariat as a class formation is disunited. There's no sense of unity. And as a consequence of them not being united, you see the landless people movement advancing a particular agenda, you see the student movements advancing a particular agenda, the workers advancing a particular agenda, and unless those struggles are combined, they will not be in a position to bring about the economic transformation you so speak about in your book. Thank you.
My name is Pedro Paulo. I'm a teacher here at Unicamp. I'd like to raise a question pretty much related to what he asked, which is the relation between the proletariat and the precariat. Because, of course, as you know, Marx thought that the proletariat was a class which had a historical mission because it was pretty much related to the reproduction, economic reproduction of the society. And the idea was to get control of the economic reproduction of the society and give autonomy to the workers, and the proletariat you mentioned is decreasing as a social sector in all developed countries. On the other hand, the precariat, I believe, as you define it, has not any clear presence or function as a class which is very much necessary for the economic reproduction of society. So Marx thought that he was talking about to a collective subject which could have a historical mission, and he thought that it was pretty much related to the function that it had in society. On the other hand, you say that your program is mostly related to reproductive program, but without any clear program related to the economic transformation of relations of production and etc. Or did I understand you wrongly? Do you think is it possible to make a relation between the struggle that the precariat could do with the struggle that the proletariat can still do regarding the economic transformation of society? Because maybe the precariat is too disunited to have a unified program as the 19th century or even the 20th century proletariat could have had.
Let me take those two. They're the standard Marxist critique I've experienced. So I'm familiar with both the Casatu line and the line you've put. I think, first of all, the proletariat is very distinctive from the precariat. The proletariat was essentially proletarianized, so that the norm of the proletariat was to be indoctrinated and habituated to stable, full-time labor. And the proletariat was exploited on workplaces. Went to the factory or the mine or whatever, early in the morning, exploited through the working day, go home, if you have any energy, you have sex, go to sleep. It was blocks of time of exploitation. The difference between that model and what is happening to the precariat is like a world apart. And I don't think analytically or politically it makes any sense to try and interpret the precariat as just precarious proletarians. The precariat is actually exploited more off the workplace than on the workplace. That is fundamentally different from any proletariat in the past. Okay? It is more fundamentally exploited through the relations of distribution. The old proletariat, at every point in its history, was paid actually by non-wage mechanisms as much as wage mechanisms because they wanted to stabilize labor supply. But the precariat does a lot of work for labor that doesn't get counted but is actually exploited. It's exploited through debt mechanisms and so on. But as I was saying too, this is the first time in history when the emerging class is expected to have qualifications above the labor it is expected to perform. That was never the case of the proletariat. It was never the case. Now, I don't think it is sensible to pretend that the proletariat ever had a homogeneity that some people talk about. It was always divided. It was always at war with its parts. So to say somehow that the precariat is divided and therefore it's not an emerging class because the proletariat was nonsense. The precariat has a different consciousness. If I start talking in classic Marxian proletarian terms, where Lenin and all the 20th century Marxists went, they wanted to turn everybody into generalized labor suppliers. The abstract labor became somehow the emancipation, which it never was. They were trying to get everybody to perform labor. That's why full employment and getting jobs and putting jobs up here on a pedestal. And I was talking to Casatu recently, and I know that Casatu is internally divided between its proletarian and its precariat parts, and the same in every country. So to me, I think it doesn't open up your imagination to try and compress these new phenomena into an old vocabulary and an old dualism between everybody in a working class and everybody in a bourgeoisie. That's the classic Marxian model. You don't ask the relevant questions if you do that. And that is what I've tried to do in this new book. What would be a charter of demands for the precariat that would not have been a charter of demands of the proletariat? It's quite different. If I'd asked you 100 years ago, what are the demands of the proletariat, you could have given me a list. If I ask you today, what is the charter of demands for a precariat, they're totally different. But if you think with the hat of a proletarian, you won't get to those questions. And that is the answer. I think analytically and politically, we have to reinvent the way we think of realities. And that is our challenge.
My question was, in this chart
Absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely, because I think transformation is, and that's why I gave my speech, transformation comes from altering the structure of distribution. It comes from altering the trajectory of how people live their lives. That is transformation. We don't want to all be proletarians. We want actually liberation from labor so that we can pursue our work and our leisure as human beings. It's developing the human condition. If you look back through the history of Marxism, not as Karl Marx in the 1844 manuscripts or the Grundis, but in actual real Marxism, they wanted everybody to be in labor. The worst Taylorist of the 20th century was Lenin. He worshipped Taylor. And they wanted people to be indoctrinated, and there was a loss of freedom. A loss of freedom. No respect for freedom. It was regarded as a bourgeois adjunct. Well, ladies and gentlemen, freedom matters. And I think we realize early Marx was great, but not the Marxism that developed after that.
Temos mais duas perguntas aqui. Primeiro, Hélio.
My name is Cheng Li, and I'm doing my master's study in Unicamp. And I have one question is about the representatives of the current class. Since it's losing a little bit of identity as a labor, so is according to your experience in working in ILO, so do you think ILO are enough, or ILO have some mechanism to be represent of this new class, the precariat? And the other one would be related a bit about you mentioned in your book about the precariat trap. Yes, because for example, in the developing countries, we're trying to, because one of the way to overcome the precocious work is to increasing the social safety net, or to improving the social protection. But in the meantime, you're also giving examples of this trap. So from the practical perspective, how to handle with this both hands? So when you want to increase the social safety net, and in other ways, you have to try to avoid with this trap. So how would be more practical to do this? Thanks.
Eu vou só complementar, mas vou fazer a pergunta em português. Guy, gostei muito da sua palestra e fiquei só com uma dúvida. Quando você falou em Great Convergence, esse é o discurso otimista da globalização. A globalização prometia que os países em desenvolvimento, aos poucos, iriam alcançando os países mais avançados. É claro que não falava que os mais avançados teriam um rebaixamento nos padrões de vida, né? A minha pergunta é a seguinte: embora as médias possam ter alguma convergência, na medida em que países emergentes têm crescido mais rapidamente e têm elevado o padrão de consumo e o bem-estar, mas nunca tivemos uma desigualdade econômica e social tão grande quanto a que a gente vê hoje em dia. Quer dizer, internamente aos países está aumentando a desigualdade e entre os países também está aumentando a desigualdade. Então, por que você fala em grande convergência?
Hello, Guy. My name is Lucas. I study historical economy here at Unicamp. My question to you is about the city. It's about the city as an element in your reasoning. I read not this book that it was just edited, but the one in 2013. No, not this one that you just. Yes. I didn't read as carefully as I wanted, but I I had a feeling that from the way you appropriate the framework of Karl Polanyi, for example, everything, all those phenomena that happen after 2011, they all have something to do with the city, to take over the city or to do something in the city, and the city, for instance, is able to cancel the differences. For example, you treat the multiculturalism and this need for an identity, and at the same time, the precariat, they have as a group, has a lot of power over the city, because key aspects of the city, for example, food, transport, if this precariat just said, "Oh, I won't do that," they can shut down a big city, for instance. And the question I wanted to put to you is, how could you, if this makes sense to you, or how could you put the city as an element in your own framework, as a decisive element, to see the city also as being disembedded from society?
Okay. I apologize. I'm not going to do justice to any of the questions, so I apologize in advance. Let me first deal with the general point about the precarity trap. I mean, it's a concept that I've developed further in the new book. The idea originally is this. If suddenly somebody loses a low-paid job, that they're just on the edge of debt or whatever, they then have to go and borrow, they have to queue, they have to try and qualify for benefits, they have to fill forms, they have to do more and more complicated processes, particularly in the rich industrialized countries. And they go through a process, and it turns out that in millions and millions of cases, it takes months before they actually get any state benefits, right? And then they're told by an employment office or whatever that they must take a low-paying job that comes up. Now, because the whole world has shifted to selective conditional transfers, people have a poverty trap. That means if they go from low benefits into low-paid jobs, they lose almost as much, and sometimes more, than they gain for taking a low-wage job. Well, in other words, the precariat is paying a tax rate of 80% or 90%, whereas our middle class pays 40% or whatever, and capital is paying 20% or whatever. So your precariat is facing twice the marginal tax rate of your proletariat or salariat. That's a particular phenomenon. But wait, supposing that a woman with a small child has just obtained benefits after months of trying, she's got those benefits. And then along comes somebody and says, you must take a job the other side of Campinas or Sao Paulo or wherever. It's only a minimum wage job. It's only a casual job. It may end in 3 weeks. Would you take that job? You would be an idiot to take that job, because very quickly you could start all the process all over again. This time having to prove that you hadn't left the job voluntarily. So you've got a precarity trap on top of the poverty trap. But there's another precarity trap that's emerging in the world. It turns out, and I've got data in the new book, that many people, young educated people, if they take a casual job that's below their level of qualifications, it lowers the probability of them ever getting a job with their qualifications. So it has a lifetime lowering effect on their income. This is the sort of trap that the precariat is facing that was never part of reality before. I hate the term social safety net. I hate it. The only thing I know about a safety net is it's got big holes. People fall through it. That's why I think we have to have ex-ante security, the whole thing that Eduardo and I have been talking about. If I understand your questions about the great convergence, this is the contextual situation we are facing in the early 21st century. China is very peculiar because I've worked in China, and it is very strange because it's rapidly developing, we know that, and yet it has become the most capitalistic country in the world. The share of national income going to labor has dropped by 20 percentage points in the last 20 years. The share going to capital has gone up by corresponding amount. China has become the biggest rentier economy in the world. More patents were registered by China last year than by the United States or anywhere else. It's an extraordinary transformation where they are a rentier economy, where they have trillions of dollars of foreign reserves, at the same time as they are moving state capital around. If you go to Britain now, the irony is that Margaret Thatcher privatized North Sea oil. It is now owned by Chinese state capital. Yeah. She should turn in her grave, silly old woman. But its capitalism is transformed. And what we're seeing is that China is becoming a trendsetter that is in contradictory ways. One of the biggest things, and Paulo Singer picked this up from the book, is that China has become a labor export regime. In Africa, for example, wherever you go, I was in Kenya recently, huge number of Chinese workers are working en masse in various countries, including Europe, including Sweden and elsewhere, and many of them are convicts. Many of them are moved around en masse, acting as a wedge. But the biggest precariat in the world are in the Chinese cities. The people without hukus, without work permits and resident permits and so on. So China is playing a big role in the whole process. Now, the last question about Polanyi. I criticized Polanyi because he was very teleological. His great transformation was like producing permanent institutions and a permanent great transformation. And in this first book, I developed the framework for a global transformation. And I was very pleased because Karl Polanyi's daughter endorsed the book and has become a friend, because I was critical of her father, but at the same time his framework of disembeddedness, re-embeddedness, double movement, commodification, these are all useful concepts. So I think we should treat Polanyi as a framework that helps us with Marx, with other great thinkers like Hannah Arendt, rethink what it is to be a progressive in the sense. But the city point. I hear David Harvey in your comments. and I think it's very interesting that David Harvey initially was very animated and anti the precariat. But I notice he's using the term a lot these days. And I don't find the city as a concept as useful as some people, I must admit. I find it very restrictive. I don't find that the city gives me a greater analytical and political handle on these issues. I agree that the issues of the commons, the issue of the reproduction, the issues of inequality, and the role of agency in cities is different. But I find it difficult, just as I find Negri and Hart limiting because of their abstractions, and they don't get down to the question of agency. This is an issue that traditional Marxists have to think, where is agency going to come from? And the agency is emerging within the precariat that is not in the proletariat. The proletariat hasn't got agency anymore. It's the precariat where the agency is developing. But thank you very much for listening and participating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your great execution.
Muito obrigado a todos, então. Thank you very much, standing, for your presence here.